being here. I'm going to do a short introduction. I'm Chris Newfield. I'm the Director of Research at the Independent Social Research Foundation. We are going to hear from Larisa, whose book we're here to talk. You'll go on 15 or 20 minutes?
15 at most, including the video.
Okay.
Hopefully.
15 minutes and then 5 to 10 from each of the commentators, and then you'll have a chance to retort if that's necessary. And then we'll just open it up to you fairly early on. We should have at least half an hour. Questions. Anyway, it's very nice to see you all here. The ISRF funds knowledge creation, but looking around at things, I find myself increasingly preoccupied with knowledge failure, especially the failure of societies to use what we know to solve obvious problems like pointless destructive warfare and global heating. So I sense in Larisa's trajectory a familiar accelerating urgency. A few years ago, she and her sister Azra made a video called "Can Honeybees Teach Us How to Live?" The answer was clearly yes. I mean, humans have really a lot to learn, and interspecies learning is one practice that can open our half-shut eyes. And yet Larisa's new book, Beekeeping in End Times, is a major escalation. It puts Islamic eschatology at the center of any bee learning we might pick up, with apocalypse as the stakes. Beekeeping here is a series of small acts of restoration in a time of climate crisis in which major human entities are still making the crisis worse. And beekeeping is also tied to Islamic eschatological lore, as Larisa puts it, teachings, contemplations, and mindfulness about living in the light of imminent death and the world's ultimate ruination. My own secular imagination first defines ruination as war, and in this case, the 1990s war in Bosnia, whose front lines are being re-inhabited by beekeepers, in part because these border zones are, in Larisa's terms, undisturbed by development or agricultural schemes, and also relatively less polluted than some other parts of the country. Many Bosnian beekeepers travel around the country forging relationships across religious lines and repaying residents in the form of honey. There's a glimpse here of a world of relationships organized successfully on the ground, mostly free of the influence of a predatory leadership class. It's a world where the bees teach us how to live, but then so do the beekeepers. The life of complex, reparative apiary practices formed one of this book's stories. Time is a wheel, and it replenishes itself if we manage better to fit human ways into it. Another story is that of the Quran and Islamic faith and its relation to the natural world. Larisa lays some of this story out in a footnote, and so I'm going to put this into the record for those of you who are inclined to skip the notes. Okay, this is a quote. Although ecology does not readily come up in mainstream conversations on Islam, the Quran and the Hadith lavish exceptional attention on plants, animals, and the elements. The core texts of Islam recommend deep concern for animal welfare and promote planting, fruit farming, nature conservation, and careful use of resources. At the same time, environmental ruination is intensifying in predominantly Muslim countries, as anywhere else in the modern world. And Islamic tradition is rarely the framework that guides animal farming or environmental management in Muslim-majority states. Sayyid Hossein Nasr, an outstanding contemporary thinker and interpreter of Islamic and Sufi sources, has long been arguing that the environmental crisis is also the spiritual crisis of modern humans, Muslims included. Overemphasis on narrow politics by Muslims and commentators on Muslim affairs alike has overshadowed most other dimensions of Islam, end quote. So, I would throw into this mix Judeo-Christian Islamophobia, which is one of the 2 or 3 central knowledge failures of the 21st century. Larisa's book brings into view Islamic ecological thought, the ecological thought of devout Muslims, that is almost completely invisible to the rest of the world, including to its major ecological movements. So 2 themes, divinity and ecological thought, and Muslim eco-practices are intertwined here, offering a unique way of thinking about the climate emergency that we must understand fully if we are to forestall our common apocalypse. I don't see how we can reverse climate change without the kind of reciprocal comprehension among members of the world's religions and between secular and religious people that Larisa's book helps advance. Okay, so I'm just a word about the ISRF before I hand it over, and to situate Larisa a little bit in the context of the other kind of amazing work that our fellows are doing. This is our 31st launch of a book associated with an ISRF fellow. These fellows often study hidden or repressed forms of potentially reparative thinking. Larisa is exemplary here. And agency that persists against impossible odds, and also the social conditions that help or hinder that agency. Fellows' topics range from social rights and economic subjectivity to disability studies, green transitions, political economy and race, and most things in between. So I'll mention just a couple of representative projects that are kind of along these lines. One is H. Patton's book on Jamaican reggae dancehall dance, in which dance refuses both psychological and physical forms of colonial subjugation and expresses an insistent heroism, an agency in the population that was not negated on the collective level, even if it was contained politically and legally for generations by the British presence there. So dance, in Patton's view, doesn't only keep hope alive, it keeps power alive, and it keeps certainty in a transformed future alive, which was a project that I thought a bit about when I was reading your book. And then a second project along these lines was Phil Crockett Thomas's book project, Abolition Science Fiction, in which incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people wrote science fiction stories as a practical attempt to rewrite our own imaginations so that we can picture our society functioning completely coherently without prisons. So the idea was that we can change policy when we can change or rewrite what we can feel collectively about our societies, and also then change what we can collectively imagine. I see Larisa's looking at me like I'm doing something different, and that's true. But I think there's a similar path of reimagination on the basis of spiritual and sort of political traditions that I found inspiring, and it's really an honor for me to be able to see this work come to fruition and to sort of be present as you continue it. All right, that said, I'm going to introduce each of the speakers one by one, and so the first is Larisa herself. Larisa Jašarević has a BA from the College of William and Mary in Virginia and a PhD from the University of Chicago, where she also taught as a senior lecturer in the Global International Studies program. She has written, in addition to the book that we're discussing today, Health and Wealth in the Bosnian Market, Intimate Debt, which came out also from Indiana University Press in 2017. She has also been a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Knowledge in Berlin. She currently lives and works as an independent scholar, beekeeper, and filmmaker in northeast Bosnia, and is a regular commentator on topics ranging from climate change and apiary ecology to Islamic metaphysics and apocalyptic thought. It's a pleasure to have you here. You want to stay sitting? I think
Maybe I'll just stand up.
okay.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the introduction. And Stuart and Despoina, thank you so much for putting this together. ISRF treats its fellows exceptionally well. And Karim, Noor, and William, thank you so much for coming, for being part of the panel, and for the gift of your presence and the gift of your thoughts. And most of all, thank you all so much for coming. We authors can do our best in the long, winding process of research and writing, but we have no means of ensuring that there'll be listeners or readers. So when there are, it feels like a small miracle and certainly a great gift. So thank you. Now I need my glasses. Too many years spent staring at insects and a few texts. So just the other day, I was preparing notes for this event, and I took a break from writing. And as I always do, I went and, what else, checked on the bees. It's very convenient. I live at the apiary. These days I live on a mountaintop village in northeastern Bosnia, on a steep, crumpled, landslide-prone piece of precious land. It's a heirloom. The land has been overplanted first by our grandparents, then my parents, then finally my mother, my sister, and myself, and especially since 2015 when the bees moved in. We lost count of resident trees, ornamentals, exotics, natives, invasives. Everything is welcome, for as long as they can take root, attract the bees, shelter and feed the birds, shade us from the scorching droughts that have become the summer norm. As long as they can help moor the grounds when flash floods raid our slopes of the mountain during the torrents that rains have become. Just behind my house is a traditional conical scap made out of wicker, plastered with horse manure actually, and lime washed. It made it through another winter. We practically had no winter to speak of. 3 days of snow, as opposed to 3 months that were customary back in the day. Actually, delayed and mild winters are much harder on bees than sub-zero temperatures for various reasons. But the other day, honeybees were doing well, by the sights of it, by the looks of it. They were all alighting at the scap, coming from all directions. And the pollen baskets on their hind legs were packed with beads of pollen, ice white, blazing yellow, orange. When they disappear into the inner darkness of the hive, the pollen beads on their legs glow as if they were torchlights. Beautiful. Honeybees going about their spring business it's a comforting sight. Heck, it's exhilarating. It's very moving. Weather-wise, we're seeing another quiet disaster. A drought which is lasting since last summer. The summer that was so hot, the bees had nothing to forage on, and they went through the winter subsisting on sugar-based honey substitutes, which we fed them. By the way, I brought some honey gifts, and as a note, it's the genuine honey. This was harvested a few years ago. No sugar substitutes. It's very rare. And yet, so the other morning, the bees were building back their societies, ramping up for another year. As one beekeeper by the name of Mehmet once put it, the bees too are hoping. I know they too are hoping. I know because I see them striving. To strive is to hope, Mehmet is implying. And hopefulness is a multi-species disposition. And hopefulness is also a virtue in Islamic tradition. Hemming invisibly this book, Beekeeping in the End Times, is my own back to land story. I have settled in the village when the research on honeybees made me so attuned to the racked climate that I had a very hard time carrying on a life in a metropolis such as Chicago. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many things I cherish about Chicago, and I actually do like London, I must say. But our cities and our urban humanities are really dooming the planet the way they are structured right now. My back to land story, however, was not born of a naive hope that the village excludes me somehow from the world going to rack and ruin. If anything, I feel more exposed to the weird weather. And this experience of exposure actually I find precious. Years of research with honeybees and their beekeepers have made me ever more alert to the signs of trouble. So Beekeeping in the End Times is a book about climate change effects on honey ecologies. And the ambivalence in the title carries through the last pages. Beekeeping of the non-industrial sign, of non-industrial kind, is nothing if not a life-stoking practice. It entails care and commitment to an insect, to an amazing insect that tends to the blooming and green planet. The End Times is a dead serious proposition that we try and engage with the ongoing wreckage, but also with our own lives, day in and day out, as if the world were on the cusp of collapse, or as if our own deaths might surprise us sooner or later. I draw inspiration from Islamic eschatology, from the teachings on death and the end times and the end in general, to speak to the quality of changes, to the signs of the times, to the feel of the second chances, to speak of the grounds of hope, and to speak of the mood of living in the end time, or in the meantime, rather. But I haven't been thinking and writing only with honeybees and beekeepers. Indispensable to this work are actually Sufis, Sufi sheikhs, Sufi dervishes, and Sufi sympathizers with whom I've been thinking. They helped deepen my understanding of Islam and my understanding of the local Bosnian Muslim folklore, including the lore on the end times. They have also emboldened me to draw on Islamic sources for inspiration, for theoretical inspiration, metaphysical inspiration, but also for inspiration on how to live, really. While drafting these notes, I consulted one wise Sufi, with whom I'm fond of thinking. His name is Zaid. What do you think? What could I say to those who would come to honor the book with their presence? I asked him. He writes back, citing Quran. He says, "Are those who know and those who do not know the same?" This is an ayah, a verse from the Quran. Knowledge, Zaid writes, is highly valued, but still, the knowledge deposited in the head alone most often does not mean a realization. It does not grant us an insight. It's not enlightening unless it descends from the head to the chest, to the breast, to the heart. In Islamic tradition, heart is a thinking faculty, it's a thinking organ. But there's enough, I think, in the global popular lore on the heart in general that I think you can think along with me, even without me delving into details. What Zaid is basically saying is that a head full of knowledge is not enough to move us to act. Instead, with just a head full of knowledge, there opens up a gap between knowledge one has and faith, belief, outlook one lives by. And this gap, Zaid is saying, is precarious, it's dangerous. Knowledge in the head, Zaid is writing, has to migrate to the heart, and in Islamic terms, this migration is known as hijrah, exile. In other words, when we have been expelled from the comfort zone, from the routine familiarity into the newness that demands of us to live by what we know, we have a chance of living otherwise. Now, the book, in a sense, speaks of things we all already know. Climate change, frailty of all the earthly species, ourselves included. The book contributes small, alarming details, easily missed, and brushes off the Islamic eschatological sources that are too seldom perused or considered useful. As such, I can only hope, and I certainly do pray, it contributes to our collective groping for vantage and for the mode in which to make the best of the end times. Now, for much of the same reasons that having motivated book writing, and my sister Larisa Jašarević and I have spent several years co-producing and co-directing a documentary film by the same name. And if anything, that film is a more intimate portrayal of beekeeping in the end times. And the film is still in post-production. What I'm going to share with you today is the first few minutes of the movie, I think.
If the world were ending, how would you know? Every 100 years, two angels ask, are the bees still swarming? The bees are still swarming, comes the reply. Well then, the angels conclude, the end is not yet. We keep bees on our father's land. It's a sweet spot on the broken planet. Far from industry, far from pesticides, lovingly planted. And yet, honey is vanishing. in the strange new weather all across the country. Honeybees are nearly starving. هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا.
Ja imam nekakav, eto da kažem, i šareć, ali to je naše ono što mi mislimo. Sve će se promijeniti za 10 godina. Ni slično neće biti ovom što mi danas živimo.
First, we're going to hear from William Galois. He is a professor of the history of the Mediterranean Islamicate world at the University of Exeter. And he is the assistant director of its Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. He's taught at SOAS, Roehampton, and here at Queen Mary before going to Exeter in 2013. His books include a comparative study of temporal cultures called Time, Religion, and History, which came out in 2007. Another, The Administration of Sickness, Medicine and Ethics in 19th Century Algeria from 2008, which examined the ways in which medicine came to emblematize the French civilizing mission in Algeria while failing as a project of medical imperialism. That book was followed by A History of Violence in the Early Algerian Colony from 2013, which used newly uncovered archival evidence to present a detailed picture of the savagery of the early French colony, asking whether we can speak of an Algerian genocide in the middle of the 19th century in the context of genocides in other settler colonies. William is currently engaged in a major research project that looks at the production of images in the Islamic world between 1880 and 1945, which promises to disrupt some central beliefs about Islamic art. And thank you for being with us.
Well, thanks for this invitation. I should say that the way that I've treated this opportunity is a bit like the dream if you're in a book club, where you actually do have the author present and you have a set of questions that you sit around in the book club and you think, well, I wonder if if they chose to do that because of that. And so I've got a set of questions, Larisa, but just one prefatory remark, which is to say that following on from what you just said, I think one of the reasons why your book will be important is because of its Islamic method. And now that's obviously not to say that there is a single kind of Islamic method that is available to us in the modern academy, but it feels to me that it joins other kind of relatively recent interventions which treat Islam as a way of doing academic work. And I think here in this context of Queen Mary, of the work of Enginison on Ottoman waqfs as forms of citizenship, or people may not like it, but something like Joseph Massad, Islam and liberalism. And to those of us who work in these kinds of fields, it's incredibly useful and inspiring to be able to work with students on texts like this. So thank you. My first question is about the issue of time and vanishing ecologies and how ecologies wane, and to what extent you saw the specific case that you were looking at in your book as a model. And the reason why I connect this with time is that it made me, because of my own interests in the past, think about ecologies that have waned and died, particularly in different parts of the Islamic world, where we often have sort of scant pieces of evidence as to what was there and how it disappeared, and whether there is any sense that your work offers scholars not just of the present and the future a guide to how these processes work, but also those who focus on the past. The second question is a slightly more personal one, and it's about you as a writer and an author, and the place that you do and don't have in your book. And I just wondered for the audience whether it might be interesting to hear you talk about your own presence and absence in this book. And I originally started thinking of this in kind of utterly cynical terms. That is to say, how could the author of this book have created a particular kind of persona that's presented, which will lead to the book selling zillions and zillions of copies? Which it seems to me is, a choice you didn't make. And not to say that your book won't sell zillions of copies, and that it won't.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and that it won't be successful. But you write in the book about, and this is a quotation, a prior receptiveness to divine self-revelation, which sets the stage for self-knowledge. And when I read parts of the book like that, as a reader, it served to explain to me why, for example, you as a person, that you're there and you're not there in the book for us as readers. So I'd be interested to know, how you felt about that when you created the text of the book. The third question is about, not about honey and not about bees or ecology, but about this being a book about the Balkans in the contemporary world, and questions of hope and questions of life after war, because there are these incredible moments in your book where, as Chris has already alluded to, there are the vivid descriptions of the return of nature in great abundance in frontline territories where, kind of a la Chernobyl, nature has returned to the place where kind of humans have destroyed so much. But and this also comes up in the kind of intercommunal relations between travelling beekeepers, who are mainly Bosnian Muslims, who in the course of their travels regularly stay with those who come from other communities and have these, intimate relationships on a periodic basis, with people that mean so much. And yet there was also this, for me, incredible moment of sadness when you described this, because you talked about one particular meal in which these people of two faiths were eating together, and they were sharing so much, but they weren't eating the same things. And I wondered, to what extent that was something that was kind of more laden with kind of metaphor for you in your project. And then the last question was about the question of interspecies relations that Chris talked about, and these wonderful moments where in the book your interlocutors say, for example, of the bees, I am at their service. And at the end of the text, we hear about a character who says that he could live without honey, but not without bees. And you know, when I was reading this, it kind of suddenly struck me that one of the things that you never write about in the book is money. I mean, you talk about poverty and you talk about kind of economic difficulty, but there is no sense in the book. I mean, I don't think you ever say, and the kind of the net effect of this is that these people who invest so much of their time have these diminished returns of honey, and the income which they derive from this is, you know, 1/3 or 1/10 of the income that they gained the year before. It somehow kind of the world of money relations has disappeared in this world that you describe, and I wonder if this is, you know, one of the kind of forms of hope of living in these end times.
Next is Dr. Karim Laham, who was a barrister at law at the Inner Temple, London. He took a master's degree from the Royal College of Art, studied law at St. Edmund Hall, Oxford, and completed a doctorate in Islamic studies at Pembroke College, Cambridge. He was called to the London Bar in 1999 as an Inner Temple major scholar and continues to practice in the field of commercial law. Karim is also a senior research fellow at Tabah Foundation in Cairo. His publications include the Roman Catholic Church's position on Islam after Vatican II, Muhammad Shahrur's cargo cult, response to Cardinal Scola's House of Lords speech, the intelligibility of the Islamic tradition in the context of modern thought, and the vocational society.
Thank you for inviting me today. I'm very glad to be here. It's very rare to find a book that expresses and illustrates the cosmological understandings that Muslims have as an intimate basis for their faith. So much of cosmology or discourses about metaphysics and cosmology is academic and in essence is a form of archaeology and doesn't actually express the living reality of how people do live as opposed to think about living. So I think that's very exciting to see this kind of literature, and inshallah it will be increased in the years to come as people discover that the fragility of the natural order is of such a scale that people are going to have to take notice of their relationship to nature. There are three or four things just briefly that I'd like to say that I got from the book. It reminded me, there was a resonance in the book that reminded me of these principles that Muslims live by and continue to live by. First is that there is a verse in the Quran, Surah Fussilat 53, it says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. We shall show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves until they understand, or it is revealed unto them, that he is the real. And this is a very important verse because it speaks of creation as an opportunity where God has manifested his divine traits. And one of the functionalities of life is to sift everything that is created for those qualities, because it's a form of knowledge. A couple of things come out of that. First is that there is nothing expendable in the world, and that goes to the economic point. If you have an economic system or an economic understanding of reality where nothing is expendable, then you have a very different order of understanding of how your commercial practices are going to be. The second thing is that it posits a hierarchy in the world. And when you say there's a hierarchy, you say that there is an order of responsibility and obligations. And one of those obligations is that God has put us on this earth, in one sense, to safeguard His creation. And why is that? Because in our tradition, the human being is known as al-nash'atu jami'a, that creature that unites or recapitulates the whole of creation. And therefore the whole of creation is an exteriorization of that which is in the human being. And the benefit of that is that when one wants to see where the human condition is going, you look to the world of nature and you see the reflection of what is taking place outside of you. In traditional medicine, this can be noticed by the Hakims, for example, in Afghanistan, Pakistan and elsewhere, where they still operate, thankfully. They often speak about the fact that they are called to the house of someone that is ill or sick, and when they arrive at this house, before they have diagnosed the patient, they look at the nature around the house, and they try and see what plants and weeds are growing, because Allah, God in His mercy, sends those medical needs into creation, and you will find a preponderance of a certain type of herb or a weed that is actually part of the cure for the person's illness. So diagnosis is not merely the patient, but also what surrounds the patient. And this combination of understanding that nature works in tandem with the human condition is very, very important for this time that we're living in, which is presented in this book. Another point to make very quickly is that for us, metaphysics is not an intellectual exercise. It is an order of principles, and principles are not material, therefore they never change. They're not subject to being old or old-fashioned or new or anything else for that matter. They are only to be debated on the basis of whether they are true or false. And principles, which are denoted by the science of metaphysics, ilm al-ilahiyat, in our tradition, when we look at the notion of cosmology, following upon the ayah that I was talking about, the verse, cosmology is essentially metaphysics writ large. It is the illustration of metaphysics. Because truth, at the end of the day, is something that has to be seen. It is a vision. It is not merely intellectual assent. And this type of what is called in Arabic mushahada is one of the cardinal principles of our cognitive system. The animal world are our companions in this world. God has put the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom and the mineral kingdom as our companions. There are psychic beings that exist in the world according to the Quran and to our traditions, but we are not to have anything to do with them. They are a separate realm. The realm that we are supposed to be involved in and engaged in is the animal kingdom, and by extension of the mineral world, then the built environment. And that determines what our architecture is. Because everything that touches the earth and everything that exchanges what God has created for something that is man-made must be worthy of that. And therefore our architecture is a sacred art as well. So is our agriculture. But when it comes to the animal kingdom and the mineral world and the plant world, the vegetable world, we also have another cardinal principle, which is that kulla samit natiq. Everything that is silent speaks. Therefore the whole universe is speaking. The miracle is not that the universe is speaking. The miracle then becomes that we can hear it. And being able to listen is an extremely important art in the spiritual elevation of students as well as their intellectual capacities, building on their intellectual capacities. I remember once Kathleen Rain, many, many years ago, said that she used to come and teach at the Royal College of Art, and she said, the problem with St. Francis is that he wished to preach to the birds. He didn't wish to listen to them. And I thought that was a very Islamic observation. We're in the business of listening to nature. We're in the business of being taught by nature. Our relationship is fundamental to nature not because it is sentimental, it is a sentimental attachment, or because it is pretty, or because we kind of like it, and so on and so forth. The real reason is because without this engagement with nature, we fail to survive. The last point I'd like to make is on eschatology. In many common parlance and discourse, eschatology is bad news. It means things are going to come to an end and it's depressing and so on and so forth. In our tradition, eschatology is not depressing. Eschatology is an expression of the divine plan for the universe. And in our tradition and our theology, everything that God does is for our good. Because God is the absolute good. God is the absolute truth. And though we may look at things and think, well, maybe they're not so good for us and so on, the divine plan is such that nothing that is evil can come from him. This has implications for how we look at eschatology. Eschatology is there in order to remind us, and going again back to the central verse of Surah Fussilat, God is trying to show us signs in order to make us understand correctly the relationship that we ought to have today with things around us. Remember, the point of life is to know God, as far as a Muslim is concerned. The point of life is not to continue it as long as possible and to live forever and so on and so forth. So the purpose of life is to know God, because God is the real, as the verse says. And if God is the real, then there is no reality other than God. And there is nothing that is worth knowing other than God. So nature is a manifestation of the divine traits. And so when we engage, as we said, with nature, we are observing the cardinal principle of Islam, which is to worship God. And to worship God is to know God. According to one of the hadiths, as interpreted by Ibn Abbas, to worship God is to know God. So the knowledge of God is the most important thing. The animal kingdom is a pathway to the knowledge of God. And that's really all I have to say.
Last but not least, Noor Sobers Khan, who completed a BA in Oriental Studies at Cambridge University with a focus on Arabic and Persian philology and literature and history of the Middle East. She also took a PhD in Islamic history in 2012 at the Faculty of Oriental Studies at Cambridge. She is currently the director of the Aga Khan Documentation Center. She was the lead curator for South Asian collections at the British Library here in London from 2015 to 2021, where she was head of the South Asia section and responsible for curating a vast collection that some of you in this room may know about. She was a principal investigator of the AHRC-funded research and digitalization project, 2 Centuries of Indian Print. She previously served as the Iran Heritage Fellowship Persian Manuscript Curator at the British Library and was curator for Turkey and the Ottoman Empire at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. Book-length publications include a monograph based on her PhD research entitled Slaves Without Shackles, Forced Labor and Manumission in the Galata Court Registers, 1560 to 1572, which came out in 2014, and a co-authored book, Qajar Women, Images of Women in 19th Century Iran from 2016. She is taught at the University of Cambridge and at Habib University in Karachi, where she served as co-director of the new Department of Comparative Liberal Studies. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Great. So as you may have gathered from that very generous introduction, I'm primarily an Islamic manuscript curator. So I've prepared a bit of a visual response. So I don't know. I mean, it's a bit experimental, but I hope that it speaks to some of the themes of your book. So, following on from the conversation around cosmology and eschatology, I wanted to bring some examples from the Islamic manuscript tradition because, as our fellow panelist Karim has pointed out, it is really kind of central to how you view the world and situate yourself in it as a Muslim. Just briefly by way of introduction, I also would like to offer some meditations on your book, which I was sort of eagerly awaiting its publication for many years. I had heard about it through mutual friends, through Janita, so I was so excited to be asked to be on the panel, and then so excited
received my copy of it to start reading. And I have to say, not only was it intellectually enriching, but as a Muslim, I found it very spiritually edifying as well. You really feel that you're thinking with Sufis and thinking together with Sufism and cosmology. And I would say that there were a number of images in the book that, for me, were really transformative, life-changing, I would say. And I sent them I typed them up and sent them to everyone I knew. I had like a sort of WhatsApp network of people learning about Islamic eschatological, apiculture. As I was reading your book, everyone was getting messages, oh my gosh, did you hear? So I would say the first image for me that kind of transformed my understanding of cosmology and the place of bees and our place in cosmology are the dual images of the bees receiving the divine revelation, and then the image of the Quran leaving the earthly realm which you and I were talking about, leaving the earthly realm at the end of times, and all of the letters and the verses leaving like a swarm of bees. I found to be one of the most moving and stirring images, and I think also encapsulates, I hope, what I've understood to be one of the core messages of your book, which is that the bees really are, in some way embody and indicate and evoke the divine revelation. So their kind of departure from the world is indicative of this kind of eschatological trajectory that the earth seems to be on. So I found those two images together to be very moving and very life-changing, I would say, as a Muslim. And the other pair of images that really struck me, and I think will stay with me, perhaps for the rest of my life, are the angels, of course, the angel waking up and asking if the bees are still swarming and then going back to sleep when he hears that they are. And then the other image is the animals making a dua for scholars, because scholars are particularly, not because scholars have some elevated status, but because they're more at risk of maybe arrogance or of misunderstanding. And I thought that these two images together, I think they kind of, they indicate the importance, I would say, of animals and human-animal relations. So those are some of the images, as I read, that I think really, in the same way that when you read a Sufi text, it kind of purifies you and enriches you. I felt the same thing as I was reading through these images and then sending them to everyone I know so they could be enriched as well, typing them up. And so I have to thank you for that. It was really a wonderful experience reading your work. In terms of I think you make a very, very important intellectual and methodological intervention into the discussion around ecology by pointing out that much of the theoretical frameworks that are at work today, such as, Donna Haraway and critiques of the Anthropocene and the need to form kind of human-animal kin relationships and decenter the human, many of them, as you point out, which is something I noticed as well in my readings, they disregard religious traditions and cosmologies and supernatural beings such as jinn or angels or devils, from the possibilities of having some kind of sharing the earth, right, and of sharing the space. And I feel that these are very powerful ideas, actually, for decentering the human, regarded in much of the literature. So I hope that your work is actually used as a theoretical tool for critiquing capitalist modernity and ecological decline. On that note, I've put a few images together that I hope respond to your work. They start off kind of normal and then get more and more kind of cosmologically inventive as they go on. The first is responding to the idea of honey as curative. I tried to look, so the thing is there are actually a lot of images of bees in the Islamic manuscript tradition, but I struggled to locate them because they're so specific. So for instance, you sort of have Indian Sufi literature like the Padmavat, right, where the main character, Padmavati, who's like a flower, always has bees buzzing around her because she's sort of sweet and, beautiful like a flower. You have a number of images of bees in the Ajaib al-Makhluqat, which is a cosmological work, right, that outlines the cosmos, and I managed to find one of those. But just to start off, so you have an image of honey here in the De Materia Medica of Dioscorides, which gets translated into Arabic, the preparation of medicine from honey. And also the other thing I have to say from the initial kind of metaphor that you construct around the bees receiving the divine revelation and then the fruit of that divine revelation being honey, which is also a shifa, right? It's a cure. This occurs again and again in the manuscript tradition. So here's just an initial image of that. This I thought you might find interesting and relevant, and maybe might speak a bit to your work. Is you might be familiar with this hadith? Okay, so I thought you might find this interesting. So there is a hadith, maybe our colleague Dr. Karim knows this story. So this is taken from an article I read in preparation for this panel about Imam Ibn Ali Talib. Oh, sorry, there's Ali ibn Abi Talib as the prince of the bees. Because during the hijrah from Mecca to Medina, there was one member of the, I forget which tribe I want to say, Banu Sulaim, but I'm not sure, it's in my notes, who didn't want to join the hijrah because he would have to leave his apiary behind and his honeybees behind. So the Prophet asks Imam Ali to talk to the bees to convince the swarm to come on the hijrah. Yes, I thought you might find it relevant to your work. So he communicates with the bees and says, the Prophet has asked me to invite you to come along on our hijrah. And the swarm of bees, you can see in the top, follows the group as they make their exile, which was ultimately spiritually rewarding and incredibly important in the history. I mean, it was formative to the history of Islam. So I thought this might be an interesting visual commentary on some of the themes in your book. In this case, it's the exit of the swarm. But, as was pointed out previously in the panel, eschatology is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily negative. In this case, the exile and the exit of the swarm from Mecca to Medina. In some ways, I think you also talk about the contamination of the hive or the contamination of the apiary and how the swarm leaves. It's, kind of in some ways echoing this narrative, right? You have the contamination of Mecca, it's kind of a contaminated space for Muslims. They can no longer live there, so they have to leave for Medina. So you have a similar exit of the honeybees as well. I'm sorry I couldn't find a picture of this in color. It was very difficult to locate. So it's in the Siyar al-Nabi. This is in the Topkapı Palace Museum. So inshallah, if we can find one and send it to you. Another image I found very striking in your book was the image of Israfil, the angel, who ends time. And I found it very interesting. I had never noticed in any of the writings on him, I'll just quote briefly from your book, is that he is covered in a fine down like a bird. So in your book you say, when the time comes, Israfil blows the horn. An attentive angel, tradition has it, his luminous body is covered with down. Yeah. I imagine bristles finer than the bees, and just as receptive. The horn has long been poised to his countless mouths, poised all across his limbs. Wakeful, Israfil has not once blinked for fear of missing the sounding cue. Every day and once a night he is overwhelmed with sorrow at the sight of hellfire, and he rains tears. God, the compassionate, has appointed such a tender creature as the herald of the earth. And so I found some images of Israfil. Interestingly, he's not depicted with down as such, but he does have feathers, I suppose, on his wings. This is, again, just to go back to this point, which I think is related to what I've understood as one of the theoretical interventions that your book is making about it, and also which I think you mentioned in the intro as well, of Islam actually as a method of thinking, Islam as a methodology. And this idea that in pre-modern Islamic cosmologies, the human was by default already decentered, right? The human was in one layer of many layers of the world. And not only was the human decentered, but the human and the animal were not necessarily stable categories. And I would say neither was the angel and the animal and the jinn. So they all kind of get mixed. So related to your question of, decentering the human, as I was going through the imagery, looking for images of Israfil, I was reminded of the imagery of the angels who hold up the throne of God, who are either depicted as animals or as animal-headed angels. So again, you have within this imagery a kind of, it echoes some of Donna Haraway's work and some of the critique of, some of the desire to create kin with non-humans and with animals, but it takes it into a more kind of supernatural realm, right? We're no longer in the material and in nature. We're in a kind of supernatural cosmic realm where the throne of God is itself upheld by animals by angels who resemble animals. So in this case, they're depicted as animals, but in other examples, you have them depicted as hybrid creatures. So sometimes with the head of an eagle or with the head of a bull. And interestingly, this isn't just in the pre-modern tradition, because this is an example of a manuscript, and then it actually makes it into print. So this is a lithograph, like a late 19th century lithograph, whereby this idea of the hybrid animal angel that holds up the throne of God, and their job is to praise God. So their job is to I think it says ta'zim and subh. So they praise God. And as well as holding up the throne. And if I'm not mistaken, the one with the bull, the head of the bull, much like Israfil, he sort of bemoans the fate of humans, and he hasn't smiled since the fall of Adam. So they're very kind of concerned about the fate of humans and the folly of humans. But again, this is just a kind of very abstract way of demonstrating that you can use Islam as a way of critiquing the Anthropocene, critiquing capitalist modernity. You have, of course, a very rich literature, looking at, indigenous perspectives of decentering the human in nature, through creating kinship with non-humans. And yet you have very, very creative imagery and ideas around the same set of principles in Islamic cosmology as well. And yes, just again, a few more examples of, some imagery surrounding Israfil and Prophet Suleiman, who again is going back to this question of listening to the wisdom that the birds and the jinn have to offer. He's often depicted at the beginning of this genre of cosmographic manuscripts because he was able to communicate with both the jinn and the animals, and that's where he derived his wisdom. And then you have Israfil again, who's blowing the trumpet at the end of times. And then I managed to find some images of bees and Nahl, who have their own category, actually. They come at the very end of this. So the way that this cosmographic manuscript is organized, many of you will be familiar with it, but if not, it's sort of organized, it goes through cosmologically all of the celestial and terrestrial realms, starting with heaven and the angels and the stars and then looking at the humans and animals and other creatures and kind of creatures that are somewhere between human and something else. And this is the concluding chapter. The Nahl gets its own section. So it might have to do with something with it having received the revelation. And so yeah, that's my visual commentary on your work. I hope it was, it was kind of an attempt at creating a kind of visual, cosmological, methodological intervention in this discussion around decentering the human. That there are many ways to do that, including manuscripts. So.
One of the projects I work on is actually dealing with a different sort of end times, which is an apocalypse for bees, which is the Asian hornet that is hanging around in Europe and keeps wanting to come and visit. And it's interesting because I'm an ecologist, so I have one approach. The beekeepers go down a very technocratic approach. They want the government to exterminate this thing as it arrives. Whereas as an ecologist, I can see that it has a place. It will find its own niche if it's allowed to. I don't know how that fits with what you're talking about.
Couple of things. I gave a talk to Danish beekeepers just recently, and also Cambridgeshire Beekeeping Association not too long ago, and they were particularly concerned about the Asian hornet, and they were. I mean, that was basically the focus of their concerns, and to me, in a sense, it hasn't yet arrived to Bosnia. So the beekeepers where I work with, our beekeepers are not necessarily worried about it, but they've got plenty to worry about already, right? So the bees have been in trouble in so many different ways, so many different diseases. pests that travel worldwide, technologies that we know that are dooming the bees and so forth. So in a sense, I see it as just yet another facet of the complex set, the tangle really of the anthropogenic pressures that are weighing on bees. And so, in a sense, what I've been trying to do is underline the climate effects on the beekeeping, because I actually feel that that is underemphasized. Not least because we've had all of these other anthropogenic pressures on the bees. And this is why varroa, the disease, the pest, the industrial technologies and so forth, they have received much attention, pesticides and so forth. We know that story. And so I've been trying to highlight something that is, I think, in a sense, compounding all of these other pressures, but also really undermining all of our efforts to deal with these piecemeal threats to the bees. Right? So that's not much of an answer, but to me, to try to sum it up, it's one of the facets, one of the problems in the whole mass of things, and it's just that I'm highlighting something that actually is certainly making things more difficult, and it is also strangely less noticed, less talked about. But as far as the eliminating a species and that being a solution to a problem, that has never been the case, right? So
You're clearly anti-extermination.
it doesn't work.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Charles.
So I work in Greece, which is getting close to Bosnia, and sort of ecologically some Balkan area. And yeah, I work in a village where they tend bees and they make honey. And all of a sudden, just 2 or 3 years ago, they began to say, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, they said the production just completely fell off the cliff. And I haven't read your book yet, and you've alluded to climate change very generally, but can you say more about what specifically happened and why it seemed to happen quite suddenly? That was my impression.
It is happening very suddenly in Bosnia, at least. So I started research in 2014, and this is something I write about in the book. When I started working, there was a saying that honey's on the wheels. And basically that was summing up a local strategy of improving the chances of getting honey by traveling these honey routes across the country. Basically, mobile beekeepers would go to various sites that are very auspicious for honey flow, and just by moving and shifting the altitudes, they improved the chances of actually getting the honey. By 2017, 19 definitely, that strategy was also failing. Now, as far as the reasons, what we can do is, what beekeepers and myself can do, is describe the things that we're seeing on the ground, right? And what we're seeing are the changes in the quality of the seasons, but also in the relationships between the plants, elements, and then elements, plants, and the bees. And this is where things get really subtle. So on one hand, we see changes in the seasons, which is basically common knowledge. Anyone who, you yourselves can tell that winters are delayed, the milder springs are coming early, and so forth. These are kind of typical changes that we're associating with climate change, and they're global. What we're seeing now is that the seasons themselves no longer hold as categories. In other words, you've got rapid fire changes of weather within each season that basically no longer makes a coherent time kind of space unit that is recognizable to either beekeepers or that is very well synced with plant and insect cycles, with their life cycles, with their phenologies. So among the so the seasons themselves have been disrupted. The daily weather media is out of whack, and then the plants are behaving strangely. So among the strange behaviors of plants are changes in the scent themselves. Scent is for us a very important. It orients us to place. It's part of our lived experience, right? A part of our being embedded in a landscape. But it's a cue for the beekeepers. They know when certain plants are opening because by the scent. But it's a vital sign for the bees as well. It navigates them to forage and so forth. The scents of the plants have been changing. Their habits, the cycles of opening the flowers, giving the nectar yields also have been strange, have been atypical. And oftentimes the beekeepers are basically pointing to the trees that are perfectly in bloom, by all appearances look like they have pollen and nectar to offer. There are no bees there. They're not attracting bees, which basically means that they're not secreting nectar, or the nectar they're secreting is evaporating because these are the plants that are, say, timed, let's say, false acacia, May, it blooms in May, but is experiencing all of a sudden temperatures that are typical of the summer. So nectar evaporates. Oftentimes beekeepers don't know what exactly is happening, but they see oddities. They see blooming trees and no bees visiting. Or they see bees visiting in scores. Linden trees are abloom, but there is no honey. They're not yielding. So these are among some of the things that they're noticing. There are changes, without taking too much of a time, there are changes in the shortage, in the duration of the bloomage as well. Whereas, highland meadows used to last, the nectar used to flow for a month or so. Now there is a compression, and beekeepers talk about it as a time compression. So 3 weeks, 4 weeks of the bloom or the nectar secretion is now down to a week. So these are among some of the things. One of the things that I do in the opening chapter, I basically put a list of these various observations, and then, little by little, sort of unpacking these things.
Well, I have very little knowledge of this, but I'm noticing you're emphasising the Islamic tradition with bees, and another lady showing stories about swarms of bees being looked after. I think I'm right that the Romans, for example, felt bees were very important. The Victorian British thought they were important, possibly more for industry than for ecology. And I'm wondering, with the Greek tradition, I'm thinking that possibly, apart from the Muslim tradition, that actually the study of bees or concept of the importance of bees, is that something through history that people, civilizations have thought bees were a signal of well-being or danger?
You're absolutely right. I mean, all of the beekeeping manuals, I don't know if anyone has read any beekeeping manuals, but by default, the opening chapter is giving a world history of the bee. And it turns out that really, I want to say all of the civilizations that have left record, pictorial, written, and so forth, have been fascinated by the bees and honey, and have imputed it very particular, oftentimes almost inevitable medicinal qualities. And so there is a very rich folklore on the bees worldwide. And I think that is, that's working to all of our advantage, because bee is one of those insects or one of those animals that people really dearly care about. And so I think it works into our advantage, because if we're moved by an insect that is also so tremendously ecologically important, right? That we might be more deeply involved in its fate and in the fact that it's being under so much pressure. And I think there's plenty of evidence for that. Back in 2000 and, early 2000s, when you had the colony collapse disorder, this global mass stats, I mean, people went wild around the world, and there were so many, at least in the English language, there were so many publications on the world without the bees. So you're absolutely right. There is a very thick history, cultural history of the bee, and the imputations of the sacredness and so forth. The reason why I'm thinking very closely with Islamic tradition, well, are many, among other things because I'm working with Bosnian Muslims, and also because I do think, being most familiar with those sources, that there is something also exceptional about it, because it's an Abrahamic tradition, and because as such it also imputes a revelation to an insect, a scripture to an insect. And I think that there is so much to be thought about there, also because it centers and the human in a sense. Honeybees and the humans are the two species that are blessed with the divine revelation. And to me, that also is very important to think about, because it implies a kind of this the inseparability of the two species' fate, which you also see in global popular discourses on the vanishing bees.
There's a very good book called The Sacred Bee, published in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of literature on this, which observes bees as part of the culture of the ancient Egyptians, the Hittites, and so on and so forth. Greeks and Romans of various schools.
You had these prophetic bee nymph prophetesses who were connected with they were like half woman bee who could who were connected with the underworld and could prophesy. So there's all sorts of bees are somehow connected with the future of humans in some respects.
I think the point is that the Greeks and the Romans are dead. They no longer exist. The ancient Greeks, with all due respect to them. So ancient Greek civilization is dead. Ancient Roman civilization is dead. The point is that Muslims today are a living tradition that exist on the earth and live by certain understandings and beliefs and practices. Hence the interest in being brought by this book to show that facet of the Islamic world, which is very often not seen, not observed, and not spoken.